John Huxford's HIATUS by Arthur Conan Doyle. Strange it is and wonderful to mark how upon this planet of ours the smallest and most insignificant of events set a train of consequences in motion which act and react until their final results are portentous and incalculable. Set a force rolling, however small, and who can say where it shall end or what it may lead to? Trifles develop into tragedies, and the bagatelle of one day ripens into the catastrophe of the next. An oyster throws out a secretion to surround a grain of sand, and so a pearl comes into being. A pearl diver fishes it up, a merchant buys it and sells it to a jeweler who disposes of it to a customer. The customer is robbed of it by two scoundrels who quarrel over the booty. One slays the other and perishes himself upon the scaffold. Here is a direct chain of events, with a sick mollusk for its first link and a gallows for its last one. Had that grain of sand not chanced to wash in between the shells of the bivalve, two living, breathing beings with all their potentialities for good and for evil would not have been blotted out from among their fellows. Who shall undertake to judge what is really small and what is great? Thus, when in the year 1821, Don Diego Salvador bethought him that if it paid the heretics in England to import the bark of his cork oaks, it would pay him also to found a factory by which the corks might be cut and sent out ready-made. Surely at first sight no very vital human interests would appear to be affected. Yet there were poor folk who would suffer, and suffer acutely, women who would weep, and men who would become sallow and hungry-looking and dangerous in places of which the Don had never heard, and all on account of that one idea which had flashed across him as he strutted, cigaretiferous, beneath the grateful shadow of his limes. So crowded is this old globe of ours, and so interlaced our interests, that one cannot think a new thought without some poor devil being the better or the worse for it. Don Diego Salvador was a capitalist, and the abstract thought soon took the concrete form of a great square plastered building, wherein a couple of hundred of his swarthy countrymen worked with deft, nimble fingers at a rate of pay which no English artisan could have accepted. Within a few months, the result of this new competition was an abrupt fall of prices in the trade, which was serious for the largest firms and disastrous for the smaller ones. A few old-established houses held on as they were, others reduced their establishments and cut down their expenses, while one or two put up their shutters and confessed themselves beaten. In this last unfortunate category was the ancient and respected firm of Fairbairn Brothers of Brisport. Several causes had led up to this disaster, though Don Diego's debut as a cork cutter had brought matters to a head. When a couple of generations back the original Fairbairn had founded the business, Brisport was a little fishing town with no outlet or occupation for her superfluous population. Men were glad to have safe and continuous work upon any terms. All this was altered now, for the town was expanding into the center of a large district in the west, and the demand for labor and its remuneration had proportionately increased. Again, in the old days, when carriage was ruinous and communication slow, the vintners of Exeter and of Barnstaple were glad to buy their corks from their neighbor of Brisport. But now the large London houses sent down their travelers, who competed with each other to gain the local custom, until profits were cut down to the vanishing point. For a long time the firm had been in a precarious position, but this further drop in prices settled the matter and compelled Mr. Charles Fairbairn, the acting manager, to close his establishment. It was a murky, foggy Saturday afternoon in November when the hands were paid for the last time, and the old building was to be finally abandoned. Mr. Fairbairn, an anxious-faced, sorrow-worn man, stood on a raised dais by the cashier while he handed the little pile of hardly-earned shillings and coppers to each successive workman as the long procession filed past his table. It was usual with the employees to clatter away the instant that they had been paid, like so many children let out of school. But today they waited, forming little groups over the great dreary room and discussing in subdued voices the misfortune which had come upon their employers, and the future which awaited themselves. When the last pile of coins had been handed across the table, and the last name checked by the cashier, the whole throng faced silently round to the man who had been their master, and waited expectantly for any words which he might have to say to them. Mr. Charles Fairbairn had not expected this, and it embarrassed him. He had waited as a matter of routine duty until the wages were paid, but he was a taciturn, slow-witted man, and he had not foreseen this sudden call upon his oratorical powers. He stroked his thin cheek nervously with his long white fingers and looked down with weak, watery eyes at the mosaic of upturned, serious faces. "I am sorry that we have to part, my men," he said at last in a crackling voice. "It's a bad day for all of us, and for Brisport too. For 3 years we have been losing money over the works. We held on in the hope of a change coming, but matters are going from bad to worse. There's nothing for it but to give it up before the balance of our fortune is swallowed up. I hope you may all be able to get work of some sort before very long. Goodbye, and God bless you." "God bless you, sir, God bless you," cried a chorus of rough voices. "3 cheers for Mr. Charles Fairbairn," shouted a bright-eyed, smart young fellow, springing up upon a bench and waving his peaked cap in the air. The crowd responded to the call, but their huzzas wanted the true ring which only a joyous heart can give. Then they began to flock out into the sunlight, looking back as they went at the long deal tables and the cork-strewn floor, above all at the sad-faced, solitary man, whose cheeks were flecked with color at the rough cordiality of their farewell. "Huxford," said the cashier, touching on the shoulder the young fellow who had led the cheering, "the governor wants to speak to you." The workman turned back and stood swinging his cap awkwardly in front of his ex-employer, while the crowd pushed on until the doorway was clear, and the heavy fog wreaths rolled unchecked into the deserted factory. "Ah, John," said Mr. Fairbairn, coming suddenly out of his reverie and taking up a letter from the table. "You have been in my service since you were a boy, and you have shown that you merited the trust which I have placed in you. From what I have heard, I think I am right in saying that this sudden want of work will affect your plans more than it will many of my other hands." "I was to be married at Shrovetide," the man answered, tracing a pattern upon the table with his horny forefinger. "I'll have to find work first." "And work, my poor fellow, is by no means easy to find. You see, you have been in this groove all your life and are unfit for anything else. It's true you've been my foreman, but even that won't help you, for the factories all over England are discharging hands, and there's not a vacancy to be had. It's a bad outlook for you and such as you." "What would you advise then, sir?" asked John Huxford. "That's what I was coming to. I have a letter here from Sheridan and Moore of Montreal asking for a good hand to take charge of a workroom. If you think it will suit you, you can go out by the next boat. The wages are far in excess of anything which I have been able to give you." "Why, sir, this is real kind of you," the young workman said earnestly. "She, my girl Mary, will be as grateful to you as I am. I know what you say is right, and that if I had to look for work, I should be likely to spend the little that I have laid by towards housekeeping before I found it. But, sir, with your leave, I'd like to speak to her about it before I made up my mind. Could you leave it open for a few hours?" "The mail goes out tomorrow," Mr. Fairbairn answered. "If you decide to accept, you can write tonight. Here is their letter, which will give you their address." John Huxford took the precious paper with a grateful heart. An hour ago his future had been all black, but now this rift of light had broken in the west, giving promise of better things. He would have liked to have said something expressive of his feelings to his employer, but the English nature is not effusive, and he could not get beyond a few choking, awkward words which were as awkwardly received by his benefactor. With a scrape and a bow, he turned on his heel and plunged out into the foggy street. So thick was the vapor that the houses over the way were only a vague loom, but the foreman hurried on with springy steps through side streets and winding lanes, past walls where the fishermen's nets were drying, and over cobble-stoned alleys redolent of herring, until he reached a modest line of whitewashed cottages fronting the sea. At the door of one of these, the young man tapped, and then, without waiting for a response, pressed down the latch and walked in. An old silvery-haired woman and a young girl hardly out of her teens were sitting on either side of the fire, and the latter sprang to her feet as he entered. "You've got some good news, John," she cried, putting her hands upon his shoulders and looking into his eyes. "I can tell it from your step, Mr. Fairbairn is going to carry on after all." "No, dear, not so good as that," John Huxford answered, smoothing back her rich brown hair. but I have an offer of a place in Canada, with good money, and if you think as I do, I shall go out to it, and you can follow with the granny whenever I have made all straight for you at the other side. What say you to that, my lass?" "Why, surely, John, what you think is right must be for the best," said the girl quietly, with trust and confidence in her pale, plain face and loving hazel eyes. "But poor Granny, how is she to cross the seas?" "Oh, never mind about me," the old woman broke in cheerfully. "I'll be no drag on you. If you want Granny, Granny's not too old to travel, and if you don't want her, why she can look after the cottage and have an English home ready for you whenever you turn back to the old country." "Of course we shall need you, Granny," John Huxford said with a cheery laugh. "Fancy leaving Granny behind. That would never do, Mary. But if you both come out, and if we are married all snug and proper at Montreal, we'll look through the whole city until we find a house something like this one, and we'll have creepers on the outside just the same, and when the doors are shut and we sit round the fire on the winter's nights, I'm hanged if we'll be able to tell that we're not at home. Besides, Mary, it's the same speech out there, and the same king and the same flag. It's not like a foreign country." "No, of course not," Mary answered with conviction. She was an orphan with no living relations save her old grandmother, and no thought in life but to make a helpful and worthy wife to the man she loved. Where these two were, she could not fail to find happiness. If John went to Canada, then Canada became home to her, for what had Brisport to offer when he was gone? "I'm to write tonight then and accept?" the young man asked. "I knew you would both be of the same mind as myself, but of course I couldn't close with the offer until we had talked it over. I can get started in a week or two, and then in a couple of months I'll have all ready for you on the other side." "It will be a weary, weary time until we hear from you, dear John," said Mary, clasping his hand. "But it's God's will, and we must be patient. Here's pen and ink. You can sit at the table and write the letter which is to take the three of us across the Atlantic." Strange how Don Diego's thoughts were molding human lives in the little Devon village. The acceptance was duly dispatched, and John Huxford began immediately to prepare for his departure, for the Montreal firm had intimated that the vacancy was a certainty, and that the chosen man might come out without delay to take over his duties. In a very few days, his scanty outfit was completed, and he started off in a coasting vessel for Liverpool, where he was to catch the passenger ship for Quebec. "Remember, John," Mary whispered, as he pressed her to his heart upon the Brisport quay, "the cottage is our own, and come what may, we have always that to fall back upon. If things should chance to turn out badly over there, we have always a roof to cover us. There you will find me until you send word to us to come." "And that will be very soon, my lass," he answered cheerfully with a last embrace. "Goodbye, Granny, goodbye." The ship was a mile and more from the land before he lost sight of the figures of the straight, slim girl and her old companion, who stood watching and waving to him from the end of the grey stone quay. It was with a sinking heart and a vague feeling of impending disaster that he saw them at last as minute specks in the distance, walking townward and disappearing amid the crowd who lined the beach. From Liverpool, the old woman and her granddaughter received a letter from John announcing that he was just starting in the barque St. Lawrence, and 6 weeks afterwards, a second longer epistle informed them of his safe arrival at Quebec, and gave them his first impressions of the country. After that, a long, unbroken silence set in. Week after week and month after month passed by, and never a word came from across the seas. A year went over their heads, and yet another, but no news of the absentee. Sheridan and Moore were written to, and replied that though John Huxford's letter had reached them, he had never presented himself, and they had been forced to fill up the vacancy as best they could. Still Mary and her grandmother hoped against hope, and looked out for the letter carrier every morning with such eagerness that the kind-hearted man would often make a detour rather than pass the two pale, anxious faces which peered at him from the cottage window. At last, 3 years after the young foreman's disappearance, old Granny died, and Mary was left alone, a broken, sorrowful woman, living as best she might on a small annuity which had descended to her, and eating her heart out as she brooded over the mystery which hung over the fate of her lover. Among the shrewd West Country neighbors, there had long, however, ceased to be any mystery in the matter. Huxford arrived safely in Canada, so much was proved by his letter. Had he met with his end in any sudden way during the journey between Quebec and Montreal, there must have been some official inquiry, and his luggage would have sufficed to have established his identity. Yet the Canadian police had been communicated with and had returned a positive answer that no inquest had been held or any body found, which could by any possibility be that of the young Englishman. The only alternative appeared to be that he had taken the first opportunity to break all the old ties and had slipped away to the backwoods or to the States to commence life anew under an altered name. Why he should do this no one professed to know, but that he had done, it appeared only too probable from the facts. Hence many a deep growl of righteous anger rose from the brawny smacksman when Mary, with her pale face and sorrow-sunken head, passed along the quays on her way to her daily marketing. And it is more than likely that if the missing man had turned up in Brisport, he might have met with some rough words or rougher usage, unless he could give some very good reason for his strange conduct. This popular view of the case never, however, occurred to the simple, trusting heart of the lonely girl, and as the years rolled by, her grief and her suspense were never for an instant tinged with a doubt as to the good faith of the missing man. From youth she grew into middle age, and from that into the autumn of her life, patient, long-suffering, and faithful, doing good as far as lay in her power, and waiting humbly until fate should restore either in this world or the next that which it had so mysteriously deprived her of. In the meantime, neither the opinion held by the minority that John Huxford was dead, nor that of the majority, which pronounced him to be faithless, represented the true state of the case. Still alive and of stainless honor, he had yet been singled out by fortune as her victim in one of those strange freaks which are of such rare occurrence, and so beyond the general experience, that they might be put by as incredible had we not the most trustworthy evidence of their occasional possibility. Landing at Quebec, with his heart full of hope and courage, John selected a dingy room in a back street, where the terms were less exorbitant than elsewhere, and conveyed thither the 2 boxes which contained his worldly goods. After taking up his quarters there, he had half a mind to change again, for the landlady and the fellow lodgers were by no means to his taste. But the Montreal coach started within a day or two, and he consoled himself by the thought that the discomfort would only last for that short time. Having written home to Mary to announce his safe arrival, he employed himself in seeing as much of the town as was possible, walking about all day, and only returning to his room at night. It happened, however, that the house on which the unfortunate youth had pitched was one which was notorious for the character of its inmates. He had been directed to it by a pimp, who found regular employment in hanging about the docks and decoying newcomers to this den. The fellow's specious manner and proffered civility had led the simple-hearted West countryman into the toils, and though his instinct told him that he was in unsafe company, he refrained, unfortunately, from at once making his escape. He contented himself with staying out all day and associating as little as possible with the other inmates. From the few words which he did let drop, however, the landlady gathered that he was a stranger without a single friend in the country to inquire after him should misfortune overtake him. The house had an evil reputation for the hocussing of sailors, which was done not only for the purpose of plundering them, but also to supply outgoing ships with crews, the men being carried on board insensible and not coming to until the ship was well down the St. Lawrence. This trade caused the wretches who followed it to be experts in the use of stupefying drugs, and they determined to practice their arts upon their friendless lodger, so as to have an opportunity of ransacking his effects, and of seeing what it might be worth their while to purloin. During the day he invariably locked his door and carried off the key in his pocket, but if they could render him insensible for the night, they could examine his boxes at their leisure, and deny afterwards that he had ever brought with him the articles which he missed. It happened, therefore, upon the eve of Huxford's departure from Quebec, that he found, upon returning to his lodgings, that his landlady and her 2 ill-favored sons, who assisted her in her trade, were waiting up for him over a bowl of punch, which they cordially invited him to share. It was a bitterly cold night, and the fragrant steam overpowered any suspicions which the young Englishman may have entertained, so he drained off a bumper, and then, retiring to his bedroom, threw himself upon his bed without undressing, and fell straight into a dreamless slumber, in which he still lay when the three conspirators crept into his chamber, and having opened his boxes, began to investigate his effects. It may have been that the speedy action of the drug caused its effect to be evanescent, or, perhaps, that the strong constitution of the victim threw it off with unusual rapidity. Whatever the cause, it is certain that John Huxford suddenly came to himself, and found the foul trio squatted round their booty, which they were dividing into the two categories of what was of value and should be taken, and what was valueless and might therefore be left. With a bound he sprang out of bed, and seizing the fellow nearest him by the collar, he slung him through the open doorway. His brother rushed at him, but the young Devonshire man met him with such a facer that he dropped in a heap upon the ground. Unfortunately, the violence of the blow caused him to overbalance himself, and tripping over his prostrate antagonist, he came down heavily upon his face. Before he could rise, the old hag sprang upon his back and clung to him, shrieking to her son to bring the poker. John managed to shake himself clear of them both, but before he could stand on his guard, he was felled from behind by a crashing blow from an iron bar, which stretched him senseless upon the floor. "You've hit too hard, Joe," said the old woman, looking down at the prostrate figure. "I heard the bone go." "If I hadn't fetched him down, he'd been too many for us," said the young villain sulkily. "Still, you might done it without killing him, clumsy," said his mother. She had had a large experience of such scenes, and knew the difference between a stunning blow and a fatal one. "He's still breathing," the other said, examining him. "The back o' his head's like a bag o' dice though. The skull's all splintered. He can't last. What are we to do?" "He'll never come to himself again," the other brother remarked. "Sarve him right. Look at my face. Let's see, mother, who's in the house." "Only 4 drunk sailors. They wouldn't turn out for any noise. It's all quiet in the street. Let's carry him down a bit, Joe, and leave him there. He can die there, and no one think the worse of us." "Take all the papers out of his pocket, then," the mother suggested. "They might help the police to trace him. His watch, too, and his money, £3 odd, better than nothing. Now carry him softly and don't slip." Kicking off their shoes, the two brothers carried the dying man downstairs and along the deserted street for a couple of 100 yards. There they laid him among the snow, where he was found by the night patrol, who carried him on a shutter to the hospital. He was duly examined by the resident surgeon, who bound up the wounded head, but gave it as his opinion that the man could not possibly live for more than 12 hours. 12 hours passed, however, and yet another 12, but John Huxford still struggled hard for his life. When at the end of 3 days he was found to be still breathing, the interest of the doctors became aroused at his extraordinary vitality, and they bled him, as the fashion was in those days, and surrounded his shattered head with ice bags. It may have been on account of these measures, or it may have been in spite of them, but at the end of a week's deep trance, the nurse in charge was astonished to hear a gabbling noise, and to find the stranger sitting up upon the couch and staring about him with wistful, wondering eyes. The surgeons were summoned to behold the phenomenon, and warmly congratulated each other upon the success of their treatment. "You have been on the brink of the grave, my man," said one of them, pressing the bandaged head back onto the pillow. "You must not excite yourself. What is your name?" No answer, save a wild stare. "Where do you come from?" Again, no answer. "He is mad," one suggested. "Or a foreigner," said another. "There were no papers on him when he came in. His linen is marked J.H. Let us try him in French and German." They tested him with as many tongues as they could muster among them, but were compelled at last to give the matter over and to leave their silent patient, still staring up wild-eyed at the whitewashed hospital ceiling. For many weeks John lay in the hospital, and for many weeks efforts were made to gain some clue as to his antecedents, but in vain. He showed, as the time rolled by, not only by his demeanor, but also by the intelligence with which he began to pick up fragments of sentences, like a clever child learning to talk, that his mind was strong enough in the present, though it was a complete blank as to the past. The man's memory of his whole life before the fatal blow was entirely and absolutely erased. He neither knew his name, his language, his home, his business, nor anything else. The doctors held learned consultations upon him and discoursed upon the center of memory and depressed tables, deranged nerve cells and cerebral congestions, but all their polysyllables began and ended at the fact that the man's memory was gone, and that it was beyond the power of science to restore it. During the weary months of his convalescence, he picked up reading and writing, but with the return of his strength came no return of his former life. England, Devonshire, Brisport, Mary, Granny, the words brought no recollection to his mind. All was absolute darkness. At last he was discharged, a friendless, tradeless, penniless man without a past and with very little to look to in the future. His very name was altered, for it had been necessary to invent one. John Huxford had passed away, and John Hardy took his place among mankind. Here was a strange outcome of a Spanish gentleman's tobacco-inspired meditations. John's case had aroused some discussion and curiosity in Quebec, so that he was not suffered to drift into utter helplessness upon emerging from the hospital. A Scotch manufacturer named 1000 Kinlay found him a post as porter in his establishment, and for a long time he worked at $7 a week at the loading and unloading of vans. In the course of years, it was noticed, however, that his memory, however defective as to the past, was extremely reliable and accurate when concerned with anything which had occurred since his accident. From the factory, he was promoted into the counting house, and the year 1835 found him a junior clerk at a salary of L120 a year. Steadily and surely John Hardy fought his way upward from post to post, with his whole heart and mind devoted to the business. In 1840 he was third clerk, in 1845 he was second, and in 1852 he became manager of the whole vast establishment, and second only to Mr. 1000 Kinlay himself. There were few who grudged John this rapid advancement, for it was obviously due to neither chance nor favoritism, but entirely to his marvelous powers of application and industry. From early morning until late in the night, he labored hard in the service of his employer, checking, overlooking, superintending, setting an example to all of cheerful devotion to duty. As he rose from one post to another, his salary increased, but it caused no alteration in his mode of living, save that it enabled him to be more open-handed to the poor. He signalized his promotion to the managership by a donation of L1000 to the hospital in which he had been treated a quarter of a century before. The remainder of his earnings he allowed to accumulate in the business, drawing a small sum quarterly for his sustenance, and still residing in the humble dwelling which he had occupied when he was a warehouse porter. In spite of his success, he was a sad, silent, morose man, solitary in his habits, and possessed always of a vague, undefined yearning, a dull feeling of dissatisfaction and of craving which never abandoned him. Often he would strive with his poor, crippled brain to pierce the curtain which divided him from the past, and to solve the enigma of his youthful existence, but though he sat many a time by the fire until his head throbbed with his efforts, John Hardy could never recall the least glimpse of John Huxford's history. On one occasion he had, in the interests of the firm, to journey to Quebec, and to visit the very cork factory which had tempted him to leave England. Strolling through the workroom with the foreman, John automatically, and without knowing what he was doing, picked up a square piece of the bark and fashioned it with 2 or 3 deft cuts of his penknife into a smooth, tapering cork. His companion picked it out of his hand and examined it with the eye of an expert. "This is not the first cork which you have cut by many a hundred, Mr. Hardy," he remarked. "Indeed you are wrong," John answered, smiling. "I never cut one before in my life." "Impossible," cried the foreman. "Here's another bit of cork." "Try again." John did his best to repeat the performance, but the brains of the manager interfered with the trained muscles of the cork cutter. The latter had not forgotten their cunning, but they needed to be left to themselves, and not directed by a mind which knew nothing of the matter. Instead of the smooth, graceful shape, he could produce nothing but rough-hewn, clumsy cylinders. "It must have been chance," said the foreman, "but I could have sworn that it was the work of an old hand." As the years passed, John's smooth English skin had warped and crinkled until he was as brown and as seamed as a walnut. His hair, too, after many years of iron gray, had finally become as white as the winters of his adopted country. Yet he was a hale and upright old man, and when he at last retired from the managership of the firm with which he had been so long connected, he bore the weight of his 70 years lightly and bravely. He was in the peculiar position himself of not knowing his own age, as it was impossible for him to do more than guess at how old he was at the time of his accident. The Franco-German War came round, and while the two great rivals were destroying each other, their more peaceful neighbors were quietly ousting them out of their markets and their commerce. Many English ports benefited by this condition of things, but none more than Brisport. It had long ceased to be a fishing village, but was now a large and prosperous town, with a great breakwater in place of the quay on which Mary had stood, and a frontage of terraces and grand hotels where all the grandees of the West Country came when they were in need of a change. All these extensions had made Brisport the center of a busy trade, and her ships found their way into every harbor in the world. Hence, it was no wonder, especially in that very busy year of 1870, that several Brisport vessels were lying in the river and alongside the wharves of Quebec. One day John Hardy, who found time hang a little on his hands since his retirement from business, strolled along by the water's edge listening to the clanking of the steam winches and watching the great barrels and cases as they were swung ashore and piled upon the wharf. He had observed the coming in of a great ocean steamer, and having waited until she was safely moored, he was turning away when a few words fell upon his ear uttered by someone on board a little weather-beaten bark close by him. It was only some commonplace order that was bawled out, but the sound fell upon the old man's ears with a strange mixture of disuse and familiarity. He stood by the vessel and heard the seamen at their work, all speaking with the same broad, pleasant, jingling accent. Why did it send such a thrill through his nerves to listen to it? He sat down upon a coil of rope and pressed his hands to his temples, drinking in the long-forgotten dialect and trying to piece together in his mind the thousand half-formed nebulous recollections which were surging up in it. Then he rose, and walking along to the stern, he read the name of the ship, the Sunlight, Brisport. Brisport. Again that flush and tingle through every nerve. Why was that word and the men's speech so familiar to him? He walked moodily home, and all night he lay tossing and sleepless, pursuing a shadowy something which was ever within his reach, and yet which ever evaded him. Early next morning, he was up and down on the wharf, listening to the talk of the West Country sailors. Every word they spoke seemed to him to revive his memory and bring him nearer to the light. From time to time they paused in their work, and seeing the white-haired stranger sitting so silently and attentively, they laughed at him and broke little jests upon him. And even these jests had a familiar sound to the exile, as they very well might, seeing that they were the same which he had heard in his youth, for no one ever makes a new joke in England. So he sat through the long day, bathing himself in the West Country speech and waiting for the light to break. And it happened that, when the sailors broke off for their midday meal, one of them, either out of curiosity or good nature, came over to the old watcher and greeted him. So John asked him to be seated on a log by his side, and began to put many questions to him about the country from which he came and the town, all which the man answered glibly enough, for there is nothing in the world that a sailor loves to talk of so much as of his native place, for it pleases him to show that he is no mere wanderer, but that he has a home to receive him whenever he shall choose to settle down to a quiet life. So the seaman prattled away about the town hall and the Martello Tower and the Esplanade and Pitt Street and the High Street, until his companion suddenly shot out a long, eager arm and caught him by the wrist. "Look here, man," he said, in a low, quick whisper. "Answer me truly as you hope for mercy. Are not the streets that run out of the High Street, Fox Street, Caroline Street, and George Street in the order named?" "They are," the sailor answered, shrinking away from the wild flashing eyes. And at that moment John's memory came back to him, and he saw clear and distinct his life as it had been, and as it should have been, with every minutest detail traced as in letters of fire. Too stricken to cry out, too stricken to weep, he could only hurry away homewards wildly and aimlessly, hurry as fast as his aged limbs would carry him, as if, poor soul, there was some chance yet of catching up the 50 years which had gone by. Staggering and tremulous, he hastened on until a film seemed to gather over his eyes, and throwing his arms into the air with a great cry, "Oh, Mary, Mary, oh, my lost, lost life," he fell senseless upon the pavement. The storm of emotion which had passed through him, and the mental shock which he had undergone, would have sent many a man into a raging fever, but John was too strong-willed and too practical to allow his strength to be wasted at the very time when he needed it most. Within a few days, he realized a portion of his property, and starting for New York, caught the first mail steamer to England. Day and night, night and day, he trod the quarterdeck, until the hardy sailors watched the old man with astonishment and marveled how any human being could do so much upon so little sleep. It was only by this unceasing exercise, by wearing down his vitality until fatigue brought lethargy, that he could prevent himself from falling into a very frenzy of despair. He hardly dared ask himself what was the object of this wild journey. What did he expect? Would Mary be still alive? She must be a very old woman. If he could but see her and mingle his tears with hers, he would be content. Let her only know that it had been no fault of his, and that they had both been victims to the same cruel fate. The cottage was her own, and she had said that she would wait for him there until she heard from him. Poor lass, she had never reckoned on such a wait as this. At last the Irish lights were sighted and passed. Land's End lay like a blue fog upon the water, and the great steamer ploughed its way along the bold Cornish coast until it dropped its anchor in Plymouth Bay. John hurried to the railway station, and within a few hours he found himself back once more in his native town, which he had quitted a poor cork cutter half a century before. But was it the same town? Were it not for the name engraved all over the station and on the hotels, John might have found a difficulty in believing it. The broad, well-paved streets, with the tram lines laid down the center, were very different from the narrow, winding lanes which he could remember. The spot upon which the station had been built was now the very center of the town, but in the old days it would have been far out in the fields. In every direction, lines of luxurious villas branched away in streets and crescents bearing names which were new to the exile. Great warehouses and long rows of shops with glittering fronts showed him how enormously Brisport had increased in wealth as well as in dimensions. It was only when he came upon the old High Street that John began to feel at home. It was much altered, but still it was recognizable, and some few of the buildings were just as he had left them. There was the place where Fairbairn's Cork Works had been. It was now occupied by a great brand-new hotel, and there was the old grey town hall. The wanderer turned down beside it and made his way with eager steps but a sinking heart in the direction of the line of cottages which he used to know so well. It was not difficult for him to find where they had been. The sea at least was as of old, and from it he could tell where the cottages had stood. But alas, where were they now? In their place, an imposing crescent of high stone houses reared their tall front to the beach. John walked wearily down past their palatial entrances, feeling heartsore and despairing, when suddenly a thrill shot through him, followed by a warm glow of excitement and of hope. For standing a little back from the line, and looking as much out of place as a bumpkin in a ballroom, was an old whitewashed cottage, with wooden porch and walls bright with creeping plants. He rubbed his eyes and stared again, but there it stood with its diamond-paned windows and white muslin curtains, the very same down to the smallest details, as it had been on the day when he last saw it. Brown hair had become white, and fishing hamlets had changed into cities, but busy hands and a faithful heart had kept Granny's cottage unchanged and ready for the wanderer. And now, when he had reached his very haven of rest, John Huxford's mind became more filled with apprehension than ever, and he came over so deadly sick that he had to sit down upon one of the beach benches which faced the cottage. An old fisherman was perched at one end of it, smoking his black clay pipe, and he remarked upon the wan face and sad eyes of the stranger. "You have overtired yourself," he said. "It doesn't do for old chaps like you and me to forget our years." "I'm better now, thank you," John answered. "Can you tell me, friend, how that one cottage came among all those fine houses?" "Why," said the old fellow, thumping his crutch energetically upon the ground, "that cottage belongs to the most obstinate woman in all England. That woman, if you'll believe me, has been offered the price of the cottage 10 times over, and yet she won't part with it. They have even promised to remove it stone by stone and put it up on some more convenient place and pay her a good round sum into the bargain, but God bless you, she wouldn't so much as hear of it." "And why was that?" asked John. "Well, that's just the funny part of it. It's all on account of a mistake. You see, her spark went away when I was a youngster, and she's got it into her head that he may come back some day and that he won't know where to go unless the cottage is there. Why, if the fellow were alive, he would be as old as you, but I've no doubt he's dead long ago. She's well quit of him, for he must have been a scamp to abandon her as he did." "Oh, he abandoned her, did he?" "Yes, went off to the States, and never so much as sent a word to bid her goodbye. It was a cruel shame, it was, for the girl has been a-waiting and a-pining for him ever since. It's my belief that it's 50 years weeping that blinded her." "She is blind," cried John, half rising to his feet. "Worse than that," said the fisherman. "She's mortal ill and not expected to live. Why, look ye, there's the doctor's carriage awaiting at her door." At this evil tidings, old John sprang up and hurried over to the cottage, where he met the physician returning to his brougham. "How is your patient, doctor?" he asked in a trembling voice. Very bad," said the man of medicine pompously. "If she continues to sink, she will be in great danger, but if, on the other hand, she takes a turn, it is possible that she may recover," with which oracular answer he drove away in a cloud of dust. John Huxford was still hesitating at the doorway, not knowing how to announce himself or how far a shock might be dangerous to the sufferer, when a gentleman in black came bustling up. "Can you tell me, my man, if this is where the sick woman is?" he asked. John nodded, and the clergyman passed in, leaving the door half open. The wanderer waited until he had gone into the inner room, and then slipped into the front parlor, where he had spent so many happy hours. All was the same as ever, down to the smallest ornaments, for Mary had been in the habit, whenever anything was broken, of replacing it with a duplicate, so that there might be no change in the room. He stood irresolute, looking about him, until he heard a woman's voice from the inner chamber, and stealing to the door he peeped in. The invalid was reclining upon a couch, propped up with pillows, and her face was turned full towards John as he looked round the door. He could have cried out as his eyes rested upon it, for there were Mary's pale, plain, sweet, homely features, as smooth and as unchanged as though she were still the half-child, half-woman whom he had pressed to his heart on the Brisport quay. Her calm, eventless, unselfish life had left none of those rude traces upon her countenance, which are the outward emblems of internal conflict and an unquiet soul. A chaste melancholy had refined and softened her expression, and her loss of sight had been compensated for by that placidity which comes upon the faces of the blind. With her silvery hair peeping out beneath her snow-white cap, and a bright smile upon her sympathetic face, she was the old Mary improved and developed, with something ethereal and angelic superadded. "You will keep a tenant in the cottage," she was saying to the clergyman, who sat with his back turned to the observer. "Choose some poor deserving folk in the parish who will be glad of a home free, and when he comes you will tell him that I have waited for him until I have been forced to go on, but that he will find me on the other side still faithful and true. There's a little money too, only a few pounds, but I should like him to have it when he comes, for he may need it, and then you will tell the folk you put in to be kind to him, for he will be grieved, poor lad, and to tell him that I was cheerful and happy up to the end. Don't let him know that I ever fretted, or he may fret too." Now John listened quietly to all this from behind the door, and more than once he had to put his hand to his throat, but when she had finished, and when he thought of her long, blameless, innocent life, and saw the dear face looking straight at him, and yet unable to see him, it became too much for his manhood, and he burst out into an irrepressible choking sob which shook his very frame. And then occurred a strange thing, for though he had spoken no word, the old woman stretched out her arms to him, and cried, "Oh, Johnny, Johnny! Oh, dear, dear Johnny, you have come back to me again." And before the parson could at all understand what had happened, those two faithful lovers were in each other's arms, weeping over each other, and patting each other's silvery heads, with their hearts so full of joy that it almost compensated for all that weary 50 years of waiting. It is hard to say how long they rejoiced together. It seemed a very short time to them, and a very long one to the reverend gentleman, who was thinking at last of stealing away, when Mary recollected his presence and the courtesy which was due to him. "My heart is full of joy, sir," she said. "It is God's will that I should not see my Johnny, but I can call his image up as clear as if I had my eyes. Now stand up, John, and I will let the gentleman see how well I remember you. He is as tall, sir, as the second shelf, as straight as an arrow, his face brown, and his eyes bright and clear. His hair is well nigh black, and his mustache the same. I shouldn't wonder if he had whiskers as well by this time. Now, sir, don't you think I can do without my sight?" The clergyman listened to her description, and looking at the battered, white-haired man before him, he hardly knew whether to laugh or to cry. But it all proved to be a laughing matter in the end, for whether it was that her illness had taken some natural turn, or that John's return had startled it away, it is certain that from that day Mary steadily improved until she was as well as ever. "No special license for me," John had said sturdily. "Looks as if we were ashamed of what we are doing, as though we hadn't the best right to be married of any two folk in the parish." So the banns were put up accordingly, and 3 times it was announced that John Huxford, bachelor, was going to be united to Mary Howden, spinster, after which, no one objecting, they were duly married accordingly. "We may not have very long in this world," said old John, "but at least we shall start fair and square in the next." John's share in the Quebec business was sold out, and gave rise to a very interesting legal question as to whether, knowing that his name was Huxford, he could still sign that of Hardy, as was necessary for the completion of the business. It was decided, however, that on his producing 2 trustworthy witnesses to his identity all would be right, so the property was duly realized and produced a very handsome fortune. Part of this John devoted to building a pretty villa just outside Brisport, and the heart of the proprietor of Beach Terrace leaped within him when he learned that the cottage was at last to be abandoned, and that it would no longer break the symmetry and impair the effect of his row of aristocratic mansions. And there in their snug new home, sitting out on the lawn in the summertime, and on either side of the fire in the winter, that worthy old couple continued for many years to live as innocently and as happily as 2 children. Those who knew them well say that there was never a shadow between them, and that the love which burned in their aged hearts was as high and as holy as that of any young couple who ever went to the altar. And through all the country round, if ever man or woman were in distress and fighting against hard times, they had only to go up to the villa to receive help, and that sympathy which is more precious than help. So when at last John and Mary fell asleep in their ripe old age, within a few hours of each other, they had all the poor and the needy and the friendless of the parish among their mourners, and in talking over the troubles which these 2 had faced so bravely, they learned that their own miseries also were but passing things, and that faith and truth can never miscarry, either in this existence or the next.